You're watching StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi, and it's good to see from Abu Dhabi. Jonathan Fulton is an associate professor with the Zayed University of Political Science and International Relations. He's also a non-resident fellow, senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much, Professor Fulton, for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Just wanted to get into what's been talked a lot about in the last month or so, this Iran-China strategic partnership, $400 billion
Mm,
over 25 years. Well, that was coming from 2016 Xi Jinping's visit, and the leak now, considering the geopolitical situation, of course, is suspect. But just wanted to get
yes.
your perspective, and I think it's a really good perspective on how you put it, on what's really been happening in terms of oil that China has been buying. So June figures you've said are the highest ever that China has imported from Saudi Arabia, whereas it's zero from Iran. So that kind of puts the whole situation in perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I would be very careful. I mean, I can understand why, especially in the US, this supposed deal is getting overhyped. But really, I would caution everybody to take a deep breath. All we're dealing with is leaks. This was first leaked last September with these breathless accounts of a $400 billion deal, 1,000 Chinese going to Iran, China taking islands from Iran for ports. This is all really, really implausible. And I think when you look at the Gulf strategic landscape, especially, what a lot of the analysis misses is that China's interests are much, much more deeply integrated on this side of the Gulf. You know, what we're seeing is a lot of focus on this China-Iran comprehensive strategic partnership that, as you rightly mentioned, was announced in 2016. What we're not seeing is that exactly 1 week before that partnership was announced, President Xi was in Riyadh and signed the exact same deal with the Saudis. And since then, he signed the same with the UAE. So you're right to mention energy. Saudi has been China's biggest crude oil supplier. It alternates between China and Russia, or sorry, Saudi and Russia. When Iranian oil basically went off the market, China lost about 7% of its crude.
Mhm.
It made that up with the rest of the GCC. So I would really caution those who are looking at this to take a bigger, a wider angle look at this and see what China's doing in the Gulf and in the broader Middle East, and not read too much into this deal with Iran.
Like you're pointing out, China has ties, whether it's energy ties, whether it's commercial or trade ties,
Mm,
diplomatic ties with the region itself, which go back much further than what's being talked about now, even though it was 2016 when Xi Jinping went to Tehran. But give us a perspective on the linkages that China has and how that's been panning out in the current year with the pandemic there in the region. Saudi Arabia, UAE, probably Bahrain, much less, if not
mm.
in relative comparison to the rest.
Sure. So what you're seeing, again, to return to these strategic partnerships that China uses, there's a hierarchy of these partnerships. And at the top is the comprehensive, and the next one down is the strategic. So in the Gulf, you'll see Iran, Saudi, and the UAE are at the comprehensive level. Then every other country except Bahrain is at the next level down. Bahrain doesn't have any kind of agreement with China. Those are the countries China perceives as having the greatest benefit in terms of economic issues, strategic issues, diplomatic cooperation, and they've been getting a lot of support with COVID. So here in the UAE, for example, it's really been a crucial partnership. We've seen this really take off in the past few months. A Chinese biometrics company from Shenzhen called BMI signed a deal with an Emirati company called G42. This has been used for testing. They've developing a vaccine here in the Emirates. China's really been very, very proactive in supporting its regional partners in treating this. So it does have a very deep and broad footprint. And I think that's another point to consider, because China's interests are more than just energy. It's also about the BRI. And that's about intra-regional connectivity. So countries like the UAE, countries like Saudi, connect more broadly throughout the Middle East into very key geostrategic countries like Egypt, increasingly Israel, whereas Iran remains an isolated revisionist country that links to non-state actors or countries of marginal power or interests. So again, take the broader perspective and consider what does working with those countries serve in terms of China's interests versus what does Iran do, and you'll see there's a big divergence.
So, are you also saying the current situation with the pandemic gives China more opportunity to influence the countries that it's dealing with in the area? Plus, what you're talking about, the isolation of Iran going against it, even though it is in a strategic location for China, that is?
Well, Iran's strategic location, I'll address that first, is important. We can't underestimate that. It does link up to a lot of Central Asian interest for China. But again, looking at the Belt and Road Initiative, there's that overland sector, the Silk Road Economic Belt, which Iran links up to. Then there's the maritime component, across the Indian Ocean region. And these ports on the Arabian Peninsula are very, very important to that. So I think a lot of analysts emphasize Iran's utility in the Belt and Road and under-recognize what these ports do for the maritime component. Now, in terms of COVID, absolutely. China has been a very savvy partner for a lot of countries in the region. I realize that for a lot of countries, China's response to the pandemic in the early stages was a big problem. But then as it became a global pandemic, obviously everybody's concern is how can you help us? Politics becomes maybe less of a concern. And for countries here in the Gulf, they've traditionally reached out to the West. They've looked towards, say, the UK or the US for support on these types of issues. Well, who in their right mind would look to the US for a response to COVID? Or the UK. So China actually does have what they see as pretty useful solutions, and it's giving yet another pillar of the relationship to develop. They don't have the same types of concerns that countries in Southeast Asia or East Asia or South Asia might have about China's influence because it's not really a core interest for China. So they're able to work on areas of mutual interest without bump in strategic areas where they might not line up so.
Just picking up from that point that you are talking about, the area could be possibly different from South Asia or Southeast Asia. Now, another big pillar in the area is the US, and many countries there are allied to the US. Is there or will there be any US pressure, considering how the US is positioning itself vis-a-vis China, to lessen the impact or influence of China in the region?
Absolutely. We've seen this a lot. So in May or April, I can't remember, but Secretary Pompeo went to Jerusalem, and during that meeting, used quite a bit of leverage to convince Israel that deeper cooperation with China in so-called sensitive areas could jeopardize their very important relationship with the U.S. Israeli leaders, I think, were not they inclined to see, and I think a lot of countries around the world would say the same thing. But what was interesting to me, being based here in the Gulf, was a State Department official said the same thing. He said, we're having the same conversation with all of our partners and allies. And we saw that here in the Emirates, where there was a very interesting report in the Financial Times around the same time, where the Emiratis had been doing this COVID testing and approached the U.S. Embassy to see if they wanted to test their embassy staff, and they didn't trust the tech because it was coming largely from China. So there was a bit of pressure coming, and again, nobody wants to see this type of a stark choice, U.S. or China. I think everybody in the Middle East and Asia, around the world, see that different countries provide different benefits, and they would like to have the flexibility to work with both. But unfortunately, leaders both in Beijing and Washington seem really set on creating this Cold War-like atmosphere, at least for the time being. Maybe that will change in November with the election. But I think what that means, especially here in the Gulf for now, given their intense security cooperation with the U.S., is they just have to kind of lessen the temperature and not really antagonize anybody and just wait and see what the U.S. election holds.
In your assessment, how much flexibility does, say, a country like India have in the region? Because we have historic ties with Iran. There are strategic ties as well. There's, of course, the Chabahar port that we're working trilaterally with Afghanistan. as well, and there are U.S. waiver of sanctions on that particular project. But then again, like China, maybe to a much lesser degree, India has deep-rooted connections with the area, whether it's in terms of its expatriates, its diaspora, its workers there, the remittances in hard currency that come home, trade ties, anti-terrorism cooperation. There have been a lot of people who've been deported from the Gulf to India as well. So how do you see India being flexible, or to use that word that's used so often now, balancing in the area?
I think India has been playing a much greater role in the Gulf in recent years. You've seen, Prime Minister Modi, of course, has been a very frequent visitor to the region. But even before him, Prime Minister Singh went to Saudi, I believe, in 2015 or 14, and signed a pretty important strategic. I don't think it was a partnership, but just an intention to work more closely on issues of strategic interest. I think India, like a lot of countries, has taken advantage of the security architecture that the U.S. has maintained in the Gulf. It creates an opportunity to work more closely with the GCC countries, and also to develop closer ties with Iran as well, because it kind of maintains a regional, I don't know, stability word for the Gulf, but most countries have known that they can come into the region and not have to worry about maintaining the security of their assets or their citizens. And this has created a pretty comfortable atmosphere to work in. So India has definitely taken advantage of the situation. It's definitely rebranded itself in the Gulf. At a elite level, I think countries see India as a very important partner, whereas maybe a few years ago that might have been less a case, where Gulf countries tended to lean more towards Pakistan in the balance you alluded to. I think most countries here now realize the importance that India plays economically. They see the U.S. as a less committed partner. That means maybe they should reach out more to extra-regional partners and powers like India and China and Japan. So we're seeing a much greater role for India here. One interesting distinction, just a last point, when you compare India and China here in the Gulf, when I go into my classroom, they're almost Nazi, and if I ask them about China, they have very set perceptions of China as a great power, but they know nothing about it on a personal or popular level. If I say name a Chinese movie star or a Chinese pop singer or a Chinese film you enjoy, they can't. But if I say, tell me a Bollywood film you love, they'll just go on and on and on. So at the popular level, India's got a much greater advantage to deepen and facilitate these ties.
That soft power India has been working on converting into something more strategic. Again, just on Iran and the Chabahar port, since you were talking about BRI connectivity, that is one area where India sees it can bypass Pakistan, because it doesn't allow on land trade between Afghanistan and India, and further on then potentially to Central Asia and Europe as well. There's been a lot of criticism of what's happening in Jawar in terms of the slowness of the pace. Reports suggesting that India had been dumped, but that has been denied again by both the Iranian and Indian officials in terms of the railway link from Chabahar to the Afghan border, the Zahedan link there. How do you see all that panning out, especially since CPEC and Gwadar is the mainstay of BRI?
Right. Well, Chabahar is interesting because I think a lot of energy for Indian projects and also Chinese projects in Iran were being developed at a different moment in time, right? Like this strategic partnership that China signed was, crucially, Xi Jinping was the first foreign leader or extra-regional leader to visit Tehran after the JCPOA was signed. And this kind of signaled maybe a return to normalcy, that maybe Iran would change its behavior and become more like a normal country. And of course, if that were the case, it's a market, tremendous opportunities for investment, regional interconnectivity. But of course, the maximum pressure and the Trump administration's approach to Iran has really laid waste to that. So I think all bets really are off until we see how the U.S.-Iran relationship takes shape. And really, I can't imagine that it's going to take tremendous diplomacy, because the Trump administration has certainly undermined everybody's faith in the value of the deal with Washington right now.
When you're talking about BRI again, just yesterday there was a quadrilateral virtual meet that Wang Yi, the state councillor and foreign minister, Chinese foreign minister, had with his counterparts, Nepalese, Pakistani, and Afghan counterparts. And again, it was the extension of CPEC into Afghanistan, plus the interregional geopolitics was probably playing out in that because, of course, Pakistan, we know, Nepal, India has also been having some problems with. Your comments on what's happening on that front?
Well, I mean, if I were advising the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in New Delhi, I wouldn't feel too good about it. Certainly, China's. I think one thing that has been, I think, underanalyzed with all the attention to this Iran deal is how this is seen as a deal that's disruptive to the Gulf region. And I think that's not the case, as I've just said. But I certainly think it's potentially disruptive to the South Asian regional order. And when you see what China's been doing with its BRI cooperation, it really has been encircling India and challenging India in a lot of countries where it tends to see itself as a natural leader. So when you see Nepal and Afghanistan and Pakistan working more closely with China on different CPEC projects or just BRI projects in general, I think it signals China's greater ambitions. It's not to challenge the U.S. I think it's maybe to do what it can to neutralize India in this Indo-Pacific or Quad partnership. So I think really that's probably the bigger piece of the puzzle for Beijing is just to try to isolate or neutralize India.
Professor Jonathan Fulton, absolutely appreciate your perspective and time. Thank you so much for joining us on StratNews Global.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And just a reminder for our viewers, if you want to get the latest news and analysis from an Indian perspective, just log on to our website, stratnewsglobal.com. You can also follow our social media handles on Twitter, on Facebook, and Instagram. And just click on that bell icon on YouTube to get reminders of videos like this one that we put up. You're watching Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.